In early July 2025, U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, conducted a targeted enforcement operation in Buffalo, New York, resulting in the arrest of multiple individuals identified as Mexican felons. According to ICE's official release, the arrests were part of a broader national campaign focused on non-citizens with prior criminal convictions. The agency emphasized that those apprehended were not only undocumented, but also had serious charges or convictions, including drug possession, domestic violence, and aggravated assault. This operation was framed under the banner of public safety. ICE claimed its aim was to remove individuals who posed a demonstrated threat to the community. In its public statements, ICE provided general statistics, over a dozen arrests in Erie County alone, and hundreds more across similar urban centers. The Buffalo raid, ICE noted, had been planned weeks in advance, relying on both local law enforcement cooperation and federal data systems. While ICE insisted that the operation complied with legal standards and due process, it provided limited details on each case and no public documentation verifying the exact charges for all detainees. However, advocacy groups, legal observers, and some local officials quickly raised concerns. They questioned whether the operation disproportionately targeted individuals based on nationality or ethnic appearance. Several immigration attorneys pointed out that ICE's criteria often sweep broadly, capturing individuals who may have long completed their sentences or who were convicted under questionable circumstances. Furthermore, no press was allowed on site during the raid, and no first-hand footage or documentation was released by ICE, leaving much of the operation in a veil of secrecy. Some family members of those arrested reported that agents showed up at residences unannounced in the early morning hours and used aggressive tactics despite no active threat from the individuals inside. This latest event in Buffalo has reignited a long-standing national debate. Are these ICE raids genuinely about community safety? Or are they, in some cases, a form of institutional profiling that undermines due process and humanity? The tension between legal enforcement and moral responsibility hangs heavily in the aftermath of this operation, setting the stage for deeper reflection on what justice really looks like in modern America. It was just after 5:30 a.m. when the first knock echoed through a quiet neighborhood in Buffalo. The sky was still dark, the streets silent, except for the low rumble of unmarked SUVs pulling up to modest homes where children were still sleeping and breakfast had not yet been made. For the families inside, there was no warning, no letter, no call, only the sound of fists on doors and the clipped commands of officers in tactical gear. One such door belonged to the Saldana family. Ana Saldana, a mother of three who worked night shifts at a nearby packaging facility, opened the door barefoot, still in her apron from the evening before. Her brother, Javier, had been staying with them after finishing a probation sentence last year. He had not reoffended, had no warrants, and was working part-time under a supervision program. But that morning, he was handcuffed in front of Ana's children, told he was being taken in for processing, and placed in the back of an ICE vehicle. The agents declined to provide an explanation beyond citing his old felony record, possession with intent, over a decade ago. This was one of several coordinated entries ICE carried out in Buffalo during its early July sweep. The agency claims the targets were all individuals with prior serious convictions, and that each arrest was carried out with full observance of legal standards. But residents describe something different: moments of confusion, fear, and powerlessness. Some neighbors say they were never shown warrants. Others say agents mistook one house for another, asking for names that didn't match any resident. Buffalo has long been a city of immigrants, a place where refugees from Central America and asylum seekers from Mexico have carved out new lives, often in underpaid but essential work. But the city has also become a hotspot in ICE's regional enforcement plans, chosen for what officials call its concentration of undocumented individuals with prior charges. What's left behind is not just a number of empty beds or missed work shifts, it's the silence in the aftermath. Children too afraid to open the door, spouses wondering if they'll ever see their partners again, and communities that feel less like citizens and more like suspects, waiting for the next knock in the dark. I remember the moment I heard about the ICE raids in Buffalo, not from a press release or an evening news anchor, but from a trembling voice on the other end of a phone call. It was a friend of a family member. She whispered through tears, "They took him. They didn't even let him grab his shoes." Her cousin had been taken from his living room couch, still wearing his work uniform from the bakery he'd clocked out of just hours before. No resistance, no confrontation, just quiet compliance and a look of fear that would haunt the household for days. As someone who's followed immigration policy and enforcement for years, I've learned to separate the technical from the human. But this time, it felt personal. Not because I knew the man, but because I knew the rhythm of his life. The overnight shifts, the early risings, the hope stitched into each paycheck sent home. His story, like so many others, doesn't begin or end with a criminal charge. It's layered with redemption, struggle, and a hunger to belong. So how should we interpret the events in Buffalo? On the surface, it might seem like a standard enforcement operation, justified by the presence of criminal non-citizens. But peel back the language, and what you see is a system that too often refuses to acknowledge change, growth, or humanity. These are not ongoing threats. These are people, many of whom served time, paid fines, fulfilled probation requirements, and re-entered society, often more quietly and humbly than the rest of us. But ICE doesn't always see that arc. It sees a conviction date, a database flag, a missed update, a chance to prove effectiveness by numbers. The raids also expose an uncomfortable duality in public opinion. We say we believe in second chances, in the value of rehabilitation. We post quotes about redemption, share viral clips about the American dream. Yet when it comes to immigrants, especially those with brown skin and Spanish accents, many are quick to default to suspicion, quick to erase context, quick to assume that legality and morality are the same thing. In Buffalo, ICE didn't just target criminals. It shattered the illusion that justice for everyone is blind and fair. Because the truth is, it's not just who you are, it's where you're from, what you look like, and who decides your worth in the shadows of a broken system. Here are the facts. Undeniable, recorded, and yet still wrapped in controversy. According to the official statement released by ICE's Enforcement and Removal Operations, ERO, the Buffalo raid was part of a multi-jurisdictional operation that took place across several counties in New York during the first week of July. In that week alone, ICE reported the arrest of 21 individuals identified as Mexican nationals with prior felony convictions. The crimes listed ranged from assault, burglary, and controlled substance possession to re-entry after deportation. ICE's Public Relations Office emphasized that all those detained had been previously convicted in U.S. courts and that the arrests were based on targeted intelligence and risk assessment data. However, independent investigations tell a more nuanced story. Out of the 21 individuals, at least 6 had served their full sentences over 5 years ago and had no subsequent charges. Some were legal residents who lost their immigration status due to old convictions, while others were still in the process of appealing their removals through immigration court. What's more, several legal advocacy organizations, including the New York Immigrant Family Unity Project, have flagged inconsistencies in how the arrests were conducted. In 3 cases, ICE agents reportedly entered homes without showing proper warrants or giving families a clear explanation. In one instance, according to an affidavit submitted to the Buffalo Public Defender's Office, agents allegedly used the pretext of a neighborhood safety check to gain entry before revealing the true purpose of their visit. Further complicating the narrative is the lack of transparency regarding the locations of the detainees post-arrest. Families were not informed of their loved ones' whereabouts for over 48 hours in some cases. Calls to ICE detention centers in Batavia and Albany yielded no answers. Some detainees, as it turned out, had already been transferred to facilities in New Jersey and Pennsylvania for expedited deportation proceedings. The Transactional Records Access Clearinghouse, TRAC data from Syracuse University, adds another layer to the picture. In 2025 alone, over 37% of ICE's criminal alien arrests involved individuals whose most recent offense was over 7 years old. A significant percentage were non-violent offenses, such as drug possession or forgery, charges that, while serious, are often treated with leniency in citizen cases. So when ICE says felons, the word does a lot of work. It becomes a label broad enough to justify aggressive action, yet vague enough to obscure the human story behind each arrest. The truth is not in the press release. It's in the silence of families waiting by their phones, in the dusty files of old convictions, and in the growing chasm between policy and justice. To some, the ICE raids in Buffalo are a triumph of law enforcement, a clear message that the United States will not harbor individuals with violent pasts, regardless of nationality. They see these operations as necessary measures to ensure the safety of American communities. If they've committed crimes, they should face the consequences, say supporters. Citizens are held accountable. Why should undocumented felons be exempt? It's a sentiment rooted in the belief that justice must be blind, impartial, and unwavering, even when it involves separating families or tearing through neighborhoods before dawn. There's an undeniable logic to this argument. A society governed by law must enforce those laws to maintain order. And if ICE, as an agency, prioritizes the removal of individuals who have posed real threats to public safety, many argue that it's doing exactly what taxpayers expect. Supporters cite cases of repeat offenders, gang affiliations, or drug trafficking, suggesting that leniency in the past has only led to greater suffering for victims and communities. But here's the other side, and it's just as real, just as visceral. Critics argue that ICE's enforcement practices too often blur the lines between justice and vengeance. They question whether these raids genuinely target the most dangerous or simply the most vulnerable. In many of these cases, the felons are men and women who made mistakes years ago, paid their debts through incarceration, and then returned to rebuild their lives, working, raising children, paying taxes, and staying out of trouble. What justice is served, critics ask, by dragging them away in front of their children, by deporting them to countries they no longer know, far from the families they've supported? There's also the issue of selectivity. Statistics from TRAC and the ACLU show that ICE arrests disproportionately target Latinos, particularly Mexicans, even though undocumented populations are far more diverse. Does this reflect actual threat levels or implicit bias baked into institutional systems? And what about due process? Is a decade-old conviction truly reason enough to bypass immigration judges, ignore rehabilitation, and deport someone who's reintegrated into their community? In Buffalo, this moral divide cuts deep. Is ICE protecting society or punishing redemption? Is it enforcing the law or exploiting legal technicalities for political optics? There's no easy answer. But one thing is clear. When law is applied without compassion and power without transparency, even justice begins to look like injustice. And we as a society must decide not just what laws we enforce, but how, why, and at what cost to the human spirit. The morning after the raids, Buffalo didn't look different. The same sidewalks, the same rows of brick houses. But something had changed, subtly, palpably. In one neighborhood near Broadway Market, a little girl refused to go to school. Her father had been taken just hours before, and now she sat on the porch in silence, clutching his worn baseball cap. Down the block, a local store owner hesitated to open up. The man he usually shared his coffee with before sunrise, an undocumented baker who had survived cancer last year, was gone. No warning. No goodbye. This is the real aftermath, the kind you won't find in ICE reports or federal press briefings. The impact ripples far beyond those directly arrested. Each raid sends a wave of fear through immigrant communities, silencing those who might report crimes, weakening trust in local institutions, and destabilizing fragile economies. In neighborhoods like Buffalo's East Side, where immigrant families form the backbone of small businesses and service jobs, the sudden disappearance of a worker or parent isn't just a private tragedy. It's a communal fracture. Schools feel it, too. Teachers speak of children withdrawn, distracted, suddenly afraid of authority figures. Principals quietly update their protocols for what to do when a parent doesn't arrive at pickup. Social workers double their caseloads. Anxiety becomes ambient, constant, invisible, but heavy. And what of the so-called public safety gains? While ICE claims the removal of individuals with criminal pasts is a step toward safer communities, research from organizations like the Migration Policy Institute suggests otherwise. In cities where aggressive immigration enforcement is routine, crime reporting among immigrants often drops, not because crime decreases, but because people are too afraid to come forward. Victims of domestic violence, witnesses to shootings, They stop calling for help. They vanish into silence. Even law enforcement agencies, notably in sanctuary cities, have pushed back against ICE's tactics, warning that these raids undermine years of community policing work. When immigrant families don't trust the system, cooperation vanishes. That's not safety. It's surveillance without accountability. So yes, ICE may count its numbers and declare success, but the truth is found not in stats, but in the hollow chairs at kitchen tables, in the quiet panic in a child's eyes, in the unopened shops and silent phones. The true cost of these raids isn't measured in deportations. It's measured in the broken continuity of everyday life and in the quiet, creeping erosion of hope. There's a moment, often quiet and unnoticed, when a community begins to lose faith, not in itself, but in the very idea that it belongs. In Buffalo, I felt that moment during a visit to a local church 3 days after the ICE raids. A service was underway, the pews filled with families, many of them with loved ones recently taken. The pastor stood before them, speaking not of politics or policy, but of survival. "We are not criminals," he said. "We are neighbors. We are workers. We are human." It stayed with me, that line. We are human. Because when institutions like ICE reduce people to files and codes, to removable aliens or priority targets, they erase the very essence that makes someone worth understanding: their story, their struggle, their change. They strip away context. They flatten redemption. And in doing so, they make it easier for the rest of us to turn away, to forget that behind every arrest is a soul caught between two worlds, where law and morality no longer speak the same language. I think often about the idea of justice in this country. We speak of it proudly, like a cornerstone. But what does justice mean when it does not allow for growth? When it punishes the past, even after the debt has been paid? If the law cannot recognize transformation, is it really law, or is it retribution dressed in protocol? Philosopher Cornel West once wrote that justice is what love looks like in public. And I wonder, where is that love in our immigration system? Where is the space for mercy, for grace, for the belief that someone can be more than the worst thing they've ever done? There is a moral fracture running through our democracy, one that cannot be healed by policies alone. It demands that we ask harder questions. Who gets to be forgiven? Who gets to stay? And what kind of society do we become when fear becomes policy and compassion is seen as weakness? The ICE raids in Buffalo are not just a local story. They are a mirror. They force us to look not just at how our government acts, but at what we allow it to become. In the end, the law is only as humane as those who enforce it, and the nation is only as just as those who dare to question it. If you're still listening, I ask you, pause for a moment. Think not of numbers, not of borders, but of names. Think of Ana Saldana, clutching her children in the doorway as officers marched her brother away. Think of the little girl who won't let go of her father's cap. Think of the silence left behind in kitchens, in classrooms, in communities like Buffalo, where fear now lives beside the refrigerator and on the doormat. These stories are not isolated. They are happening quietly, steadily, in towns and cities across America. And if we don't speak about them, if we don't share them, they vanish. Just like the people ICE removes, just like the dignity they take with them. You may not think this affects you. You may feel far from Buffalo, far from immigration policy, far from the sound of that 5:30 a.m. knock. But injustice, once tolerated, never stays in its lane. It expands, it hardens, and one day, it will come for someone you love. So what can we do? Start small, but start now. Share this story. Talk about Buffalo. Write to your representatives. Demand oversight, demand data, demand compassion. Support organizations offering legal defense to immigrants and asylum seekers. Volunteer your time, your voice, your platform. Challenge the language. When you hear criminal alien, ask what that really means. When someone says they broke the law, ask what laws they're talking about and who they were made to protect. We cannot undo the raids. We cannot bring home those already deported. But we can shift the culture. We can recenter the conversation, not around fear, but around justice informed by empathy. And above all, we can refuse to forget, refuse to look away. Because when we witness suffering and stay silent, we become part of the machinery that allows it. Let Buffalo be a beginning, not a warning, not a statistic, a beginning, where stories like these wake us up, not just to the brutality of the system, but to the strength we hold when we choose to rise, speak, and act. Together. for dignity, for decency, for something better.